Today, we're going to look past the labels we often use and try to understand the full picture of what a child might be experiencing. We're talking about those kids who are so often misunderstood and what's really going on beneath the surface.
So, I want you to think about a child you might know. You see them being impulsive, or maybe they seem really distracted. But what if they're actually just overwhelmed? It's a pretty important question, right? Because the way we answer it completely changes how we can help.
You've probably seen this before. A kid who just can't sit still. Their focus seems to jump from one thing to the next, and following instructions is a real challenge. The first thought for many of us is ADHD. And it might be. But is that really the whole story? As we're about to find out, that label might just be describing what we see, not why it's happening.
All right, let's get into it. To really get the full picture here, we have to start with the what. So what exactly is ADHD when we look at it from a traditional diagnostic point of view? Well, it all comes down to behaviors you can actually see.
So, clinically speaking, ADHD is defined by these persistent patterns, right? Inattention, hyperactivity, and impulsivity. These are things you can observe and measure, and for a diagnosis, they have to be significant enough to really impact a person's life, not just in one place, but everywhere, like at school, at home, with friends. This is the descriptive label. It tells us what is happening.
Okay, but this is where things get really fascinating. If ADHD describes the what, then sensory processing can often help us understand the why. It's kind of like lifting the hood on a car to see how the engine is actually working. Or in this case, looking at the brain's internal traffic control system.
Sensory processing is basically how our brain makes sense of the world. And it's not just about the 5 senses we learned about in school. It also includes 2 really important ones: proprioception, which is our sense of where our body is in space, and our vestibular sense, which is all about balance and movement. For most of us, this whole process is automatic. We don't even think about it. But for some people, that system is just wired a little differently.
Now check this out, because this is where the neuroscience gets really cool. These aren't just 2 different terms for the same problem. They're actually linked to different parts of the brain. ADHD is typically associated with the frontal regions. You can think of that as the brain's CEO, in charge of planning and focus, and neurotransmitters like dopamine. Sensory issues, though, are more connected to the brain's wiring in the back, the white matter that acts like a superhighway for information. That is a really important distinction. So now we have the what, which is the behavior, and a potential why, which is the sensory piece. So how do we start connecting these dots? It's all about realizing that a single behavior can be driven by completely different internal experiences.
And this connection is way more common than you might think. Get this. Research shows that up to 40%, that's a huge number, 40% of kids diagnosed with ADD also have pretty significant sensory processing challenges. So these 2 things don't just happen to be related. They often exist together in the same person.
Let's look at a real-world example: distractibility. Okay, so if you're looking through an ADHD lens, you see a problem with executive function. The brain's filter just isn't working right. But if you switch to a sensory lens, that same distractibility might actually be a nervous system that's completely flooded and overwhelmed by all the lights, the sounds, even the feeling of the chair. It's not about focus, it's about overload. And this slide illustrates the same idea for hyperactivity. Through that ADHD lens, you just see restlessness, an inability to be still. But the sensory lens reveals something else entirely. Maybe that child isn't just restless. Maybe they are actively seeking intense feelings, like jumping or crashing around, because their body needs that input to feel calm and organized. The movement isn't the problem. It's their solution. It's a regulatory strategy.
Now, to make sense of all this, it really helps to have a kind of map. And luckily, experts have come up with some great frameworks to help us organize and understand all these different sensory patterns. So a really useful framework breaks it all down into 2 main patterns. First up is sensory reactivity. I want you to think of this like the brain's volume control. Is the reaction to sensory input turned way up, way down, or is it just right? Then, the second pattern is sensory perception. This is all about clarity. Is the brain getting a clear picture and accurately interpreting the details of what it's sensing?
Let's dig into that reactivity piece, the volume control. We usually see 3 common patterns. There's hyperreactivity, where the volume is cranked to 11. A scratchy tag on a shirt feels totally unbearable. Then you have the opposite, hyporeactivity, where the volume is too low. A child might not even notice their face is covered in ketchup. And finally, there's sensory seeking, which we just talked about. This is when someone is actively trying to turn up the volume by crashing, spinning, and moving constantly.
So what's the big takeaway here? With this deeper understanding, we can actually change our whole approach. We can move past just reacting to a label and start offering support that's actually driven by the function of the behavior, the why behind it.
This table just lays it out so perfectly. If the underlying mechanism is overreactivity, and that's causing meltdowns in a loud lunchroom, the strategy isn't punishment, it's noise-canceling headphones. If a kid is fidgeting nonstop because their body is sensory seeking, the solution isn't to tell them to stop it, it's to give them what their body needs, like planned movement breaks. It's all about matching the strategy to the underlying need.
And the great news is there are so many tools we can put in this toolbox. Simple things like dimming the lights or reducing clutter can make a world of difference. Predictable routines are huge for lowering anxiety. And occupational therapists are amazing at creating what's called a sensory diet, which is just a personalized plan of activities that gives a child the right sensory input they need all day to feel regulated and ready to take on the world.
So what this all really leads to is a pretty big shift in how we see things. It's about combining these two lenses, the behavioral one and the sensory one, so we can finally see the whole child.
And this right here is the ultimate point. The goal isn't to throw away the ADHD diagnosis. Not at all. It's to enrich it. It's about adding this whole other layer of understanding that lets us move beyond just managing behaviors on the surface and lets us start truly supporting the person from the inside out.
This quote just says it all, doesn't it? The best support is never a one-size-fits-all plan that's just based on a label. It's an approach that's tailored to the individual, one that always asks, what function does this behavior serve for this person in this moment, and how can we help meet that underlying need? So I'll just leave you with this question to think about. Consider a child you know who struggles. How might changing your perspective from only seeing the what, the behavior, to trying to understand the why, their sensory experience, how could that change how you see them, how you connect with them, and how you support them? Honestly, it could change everything.